the backlash point you made, where you explained that it's typically come from the US, that it's become politicized, I would add a wrinkle to that and suggest that actually ESG, even by its proponents, would have admitted that ESG by its nature was political, insofar as I don't think you can get away from the fact that there are political philosophies embedded within the concept. So on the social front, typically that is geared towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. The equity became equity through the pandemic. So it flipped from what was typically equality to equity, two very different things. And within that, the proponents, particularly of the DEI element, have a worldview which critics would say sees the world in an oppressor's and oppressed category, and then categorizes different ethnic groups based on where they sit on that scale as they see it. And what this has meant, and as Vivek Ramaswamy, who running for the Republican candidacy in the US has spoken so much about, is that if people are saying that systemic racism exists, that it ought not to be replaced by another form of systemic racism. Racism is racism, whichever way it cuts. And so I think that's probably why there's been a backlash against the social elements. And on the environmental front, I mean, from a US perspective, big oil and gas producer, they're looking at this going, you know, from a civilizational perspective, China, our big geopolitical rival, has something like 96% of control of 96% of all the components that are needed for an energy transition towards electric vehicles, for example, and renewable energy. If we are to suggest that this is the way forward, we're going to end up making ourselves economically unviable and passing the power into a geopolitical rival. And so I would say that the backlash is an example of a point that Ian McGilchrist, he's a famous philosopher, psychologist, not a psychotherapist, a neurologist, and literary scholar. He talks about there being a coincidentia oppositorum, that everything that is brought into being brings an opposite into being. And I believe that the ESG domain has been a bit of an ideological filter bubble, and it has asserted legitimacy over some points, but has not accepted pushback. And I think it's gotten to the point where it may have caused, because of those blind spots, it's caused the pushback because it's not opened itself up to reform. What do you make of any of those points?
Very interesting points. I mean, one thing you said yourself, we shouldn't also create a plain brushstroke and look at region by region, say they are pro versus, again, con ESG. Again, we're talking about the different shades of green here. Even in the US, if you look at climate risk regulation, you mentioned social and human capital management related or DEI related regulation, we see different facets. And we see, for instance, a federal push for supplier governance around climate risk management versus state-based regulation and potentially pushback. But again, then you see in states run by certain groups a clear commitment towards climate risk management versus in others, you see, of course, the powers of lobbyism, of industry interests, and so on and so forth, taking reign and looking in the geopolitical context, and rightly so, also it means of competition and competitive advantage, exactly as you'd outlined. So again, I think it would be false to say it has achieved generally full backlash, slash there is not a one-size-fits-all approach or one policy-size-fits-all approach. We have to really look at this picture in a very multifaceted way. What we definitely have to see, and this is something that comes up in the context of other discussions around carbon credit management, for instance, and voluntary carbon markets concepts, when and where you can find new means and mechanisms for product for trade to actually build infrastructure solutions that can reach much larger audiences and tackle much wider problems versus focusing, and that's maybe also the big issue with ESG because it's so well diversified, on the smaller chunks of sustainable investment to build long-term trajectories. I think what is making ESG complex is that it tries to address, maybe too quickly and in too many ways, the systemic issues of this world. And again, that's why I said having potentially would have made more sense breaking the challenges and the pillars around ESG up and looking more specifically at certain areas that require prioritization, also in maybe a climate risk urgency, biodiversity risk urgency context, but also in a socioeconomic context that require certain levels of prioritization, and working then with stakeholders, policymakers, regulators up and foremost through means of, again, interoperability and global platforms and global mechanisms and organizations to drive a globally standardized and normalized approach. I think a lot of the backlash we're seeing is still linked to lack of awareness, really now the fear of the complexity, and ultimately maybe also the lack of a general commitment from the wider public and the consumers to focus on these topics in times when we are all as consumers facing enormous constraints, also linked to a lot of the geopolitical issues and backlash that we are seeing around the world. So I think it's not the right time, per se, to push concepts that are not concerning us all, but herein lies the conundrum with ESG. These are concepts that should literally concern us all. I think we just need better representation, up and foremost at policy and regulatory level, potentially, to work with us as consumers, and then also, of course, with industry, to get them better aligned and to get them standardized.